Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 281. And this time I'm going to talk about this record by the Wailers from 1973, Burnin. I have a 1981 Canadian reissue, which is actually a little bit unsatisfactory as a repress. In any event, this is the sixth and last LP put out by Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, and Bunny Wailer as the Wailers before they went their separate ways in 1974. It includes a number of classic Wailers tracks and some re-recordings of tracks which they had previously done with the Jamaican producer Lee Scratch Perry in the late 60s before the band were signed to Chris Blackwell's Island Records out of the UK. It's their second record for Island. It's more straightforward and politically uncompromising than its predecessor Catch a Fire, and in the eyes of many, including mine, it's their peak achievement as a band. I previously covered the Wailers' late 60s history in my review of Catch a Fire, and just to recall, the Wailers had formed in the early 1960s. They had been part of the ska boom, they had then been part of the rocksteady boom and the whole rude boy thing, but their identity had slowly come together around a new sound which became the true sound of roots reggae. And in developing this sound, the Wailers were drawing on the fact that they were already by 1967, which was kind of the heyday of rocksteady, distinct from other major Jamaican music stars, people like Desmond Dekker, because by that point, by 1967, they were all devout Rastafarians. And what they were developing was a sound which was more politically, socially, and spiritually conscious than rocksteady. Their early ally in developing this sound was the producer Lee Perry, who helped them get a deeper, slower sound along with the fantastic contribution of his in-house band, the Upsetters. However, that relationship had broken down when the band found out that Perry had been secretly selling the Wailers' product in the UK without really giving them their cut. And there was more bad blood between the Wailers and Perry when the backing band, the Upsetters, decided to take the Wailers' side in that dispute and abandoned Perry as well. Adrift from their Jamaican connections, the band was touring in the UK in the winter of 1971. They run out of money. They're bailed out by Chris Blackwell, who is the owner of Island Records, and he ends up signing them and bankrolling their first record for Island, Catch a Fire, in 1972. Momentum was building, and so during the winter of 1972-73, during the tour, which continued to support Catch a Fire, the band began to return to Kingston, to Harry J's studio, to record the tracks which would become the basis of Burnin. They then went off to London in the spring of 1973 and continued to tour to support their previous record while going into the studio with Island to do overdubs and finish up the record. But the mood was increasingly sour within the band because they felt they weren't being treated that well by their label. They were put up in what was basically a little bit better than a squat in Hammersmith with just mattresses on the floor. But the experience for the band was not really consistent for everybody because while Bunny and Peter and Aston Barrett and Carlton Barrett and Earl Wire Lindo were all staying in this squat, Bob had found a girlfriend in London, a woman called Esther Anderson, and he was over at her place the whole time. Has to be said, though, that Esther's role with the Wailers is far more significant than just taking care of Bob's creature comforts. She was a really remarkable figure. She was a former Miss Jamaica who had won the title at age 14. When they found out she was 14, it was a big scandal, so they downgraded her to third place. But she took her prize money and then went off to the UK, and she becomes an actress, she becomes a model, she becomes a go-go dancer on the famous TV pop show Ready, Steady, Go. And she also, from her earliest time in London in the mid-1960s, gets work from Chris Blackwell. She does promotions, she takes photos, she actually writes lyrics for a lot of the bands that come through. She took lots and lots of photos of the Wailers when they were in London in 1972 and 1973. Most photos you'll see from that era, or many of them anyway, are Esther Anderson photos. And she also shot several reels of candid film, basically chatting with the band here and there. These reels get lost. They're lost for 30 years. They turn up in someone's garage in Canada in the early 2000s, and they become the basis for a 2011 film called Bob Marley, The Making of a Legend. And she also, importantly for our purposes here, contributes lyrics to both Catch a Fire and to this record. Now, getting back to the Wailers, while Bob's living circumstances were certainly an irritant, they were by no means the biggest issue facing the band. They were facing, at this point, some real kind of existential issues around the trajectory and the image of the band, largely driven by certainly what Bunny and Peter saw as Chris Blackwell's insistence that Marley was the leader of the band. And it wasn't just image, because Bunny and Peter's songs were also getting ignored in the studio and left off the record. For his part, Bob could see this happening too, and it was upsetting to him. He reaches out to Peter and gets Peter to sing on Get Up, Stand Up and gives him a co-writing credit to make sure he's got at least 2 credits on the record. But that alone was insufficient to stop what was basically the unraveling of the band, the unraveling of this fellowship these guys had had for about 12 years. Bunny and Peter were getting unhappy at the second billing. If you look at this record cover, for instance, there's Bob, kind of, large and in charge in the front. There's Bunny, there's Peter, looking just like, the rest of the members of the band. These guys had just joined like a year or two before. And then if you open it up, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 solo pictures of Bob. I can see one picture of Bunny, and I don't know if there are any solo pictures of Peter. And then, of course, the back, you've got Bob. So it's pretty clear what was happening. Bunny and Peter, too, were uncomfortable at this headlong rush on the part of Island Records to get a big white fan base in the US and the UK. It graded with Bunny because he was by some distance the most spiritual of the three. It graded with Peter because he was the most assertively anti-colonial of the three. And with increasing pace, all of these different tensions ultimately ripped the band apart. The basic tracks for this record were laid down at Harry J's studio in Kingston, Jamaica, not Tough Gong, which you will read, but it was actually at Harry J's, in the winter of 1972-73. The tapes were then taken to London by the band, where they worked with Chris Blackwell at Island to finish, to overdub, and to mix the record by the spring of 1973. By any standard, this pressing notwithstanding, it's a beautifully recorded record. Bob and Peter both sing and play guitar. Bunny sings and adds percussion. And of the former upsetters, Family Man Barrett is on bass, Carlton Barrett's on drums, and Wire Lindo is on keyboards. As I mentioned, there are several tracks here which are re-recordings of Lee Perry productions, including Put It On, Small Axe, and Duffy Conqueror. The 3 songs which do get left off are all by either Peter or Bunny. Those include No Sympathy by Peter, and he'd later re-record that and release it on his debut record, Legalize It. And they also include 2 songs by Bunny, the Oppressed song, and also Reincarnated Souls. And Reincarnated Souls was actually supposed to have been the title of the record, but it was left off. To say the least, Bunny was not pleased, and he didn't trust Blackwell when it came to the publishing. So what he did was, for his own songs, he actually had them credited to his wife's name, Jean Watt, because he thought if he left the band, somehow or other, his songwriting credits might just get subsumed under Bob and Peter. So he leaves the band, he goes back to Jamaica, he refuses to tour in support of the record. In 1974, when Blackwell then says to Peter Tosh, I'm not going to release your solo record, Peter leaves as well. And so within 6 months or so of the release of this record, the band is basically done. Side 1 starts with one of the great politically conscious roots reggae tracks, Get Up, Stand Up. And this is a song which is credited to Bob Marley and Peter Tosh, but most of it was actually written by Bob and by Esther Anderson on a plane ride between Haiti and Jamaica in 1973. The next song is Hallelujah Time. This is a beautiful hymn-like track. It's credited to Jean Watt, but of course this is Bunny and Bunny Sings. Then we come to I Shot the Sheriff, arguably the most famous reggae track in history. There are significant differences between this version and the single version, and also the version on Legend. This one has an organ solo by Lindo, and also the Barrett Brothers rhythm section breakdown at the end. The next track, Burning and Looting, is about the realities which caused oppressed people to riot, and then the ironic/cruel fact that the rioting is then used as a rationale to continue oppression. And the last track on side 1 is Put It On, which is one of the re-recorded tracks from the Lee Perry era. This is a gorgeous, uplifting, spiritual track which should be better known. Lee Perry's version had the vocals very much in the front. This is more balanced with the instrumentation. Side 2 starts with the second of those re-recorded tracks, Small Axe. This is the classic diss track aimed at the big-time record producers in Jamaica of the 1960s, people like Cox and Dodd, Joe Gibbs, Duke Reed. Pass It On is another spiritual by Bunny, which has a distinctly Motown feel. Then the third of the re-recorded tracks, Duffy Conqueror, and this is the one which was the most different from the earlier version. It is mellower, it is looser, it is slower, it's a whole different vibe, it's much more bass heavy. One Foundation is the only solely authored track by Peter, which makes the record. The final track in the record, Rastaman Chant, is a traditional spiritual track, kind of a work song, given a pretty good treatment in the studio and a really nice piece of variety to end the record. In most estimations, including mine, this record is the crowning achievement of reggae's greatest ever band. There may be individuals who rival the members of the Wailers as reggae artists overall, but no collective in the genre ever had the impact that these three had. And arguably none of the three ever topped this, despite the fact that they all produced great music after the split. It's a real tragedy this band couldn't be kept together, but this is the influence of money and fame. It is one of the handful of records that should be in any collection of reggae, and for me, it's 5 out of 5 stars.